Welcome to Enigma of the Unknown, where we explore the most chilling and mysterious tales from across the globe. Tonight, we're heading deep into the forests and swamps of Mississippi, a land steeped in history and haunted by dark legends. From the eerie whispers of Homochitto Forest to the faceless woman of Yazoo Swamp, these 6 terrifying camping stories will take you to the heart of fear. Dim the lights, settle in, and prepare to uncover the secrets lurking in Mississippi's wilderness. Story number 1. Whispers in the Homochitto Forest. I've always been an avid camper, seeking solace in the embrace of nature whenever city life became too overwhelming. So when my longtime friend Marcus suggested a weekend getaway to Homochitto National Forest in Mississippi, I didn't hesitate. A few days surrounded by towering pines and the melody of rustling leaves sounded like the perfect antidote to our stressful jobs. Have you ever been to Homochitto? Marcus asked as we packed up the car. Can't say that I have, I replied, tossing my backpack into the trunk. But I've heard it's beautiful. He gave me a sly grin. It's got its share of legends too. Legends? I raised an eyebrow. Marcus loved a good ghost story. Yeah, some say the forest is haunted, he said, his tone half serious. Whispers in the night, that sort of thing. I chuckled. Every old forest has its ghost stories. Adds to the charm. We set off early Saturday morning, the sun casting a warm glow over the horizon. The drive from New Orleans was pleasant, filled with the usual banter and a curated playlist of our favorite songs. As we approached the forest, the dense canopy of trees seemed to swallow the sunlight, casting long shadows over the winding road. Upon arrival, we checked in at the ranger station. A weathered man with silver hair and kind eyes greeted us. Evening, gentlemen, he said. Planning to camp overnight? Yes, sir, Marcus replied. Thought we'd take Trail 6 up to the ridge. The ranger's expression tightened ever so slightly. Trail 6, huh? Beautiful area, but folks sometimes get turned around up there. Make sure you have a good map and stay on the path. Will do, I assured him. As we headed out, Marcus nudged me. Did you see the look he gave us? Probably just wants to make sure we don't litter, I joked. We hiked for a few hours before finding the perfect spot, a small clearing near a gentle stream, far enough from the main path to feel secluded but close enough for safety. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and settled in as the sky began to blush with the colors of dusk. Sitting by the crackling fire, we roasted marshmallows and shared stories from our college days. The forest around us was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, a symphony of chirps, hoots, and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. Did you hear that? Marcus asked suddenly, his gaze snapping to the darkness beyond the firelight. I paused, listening. Hear what? He frowned. Thought I heard someone calling my name. I smirked. Must be the wind, or maybe the spirits you mentioned. He chuckled nervously. Yeah, maybe. As the night deepened, fatigue pulled me toward my tent. I'm turning in, I said, stifling a yawn. Same here, Marcus agreed. Big hike tomorrow. I awoke to the faint sound of whispering. Groggy. I glanced at my watch. 2:13 a.m. The murmurs were soft, almost indistinct, like leaves brushing against each other. I told myself it was just the forest's natural soundtrack. Closing my eyes, I tried to drift back to sleep, but then I heard it clearly. Daniel, my name, carried on a breath of wind. My eyes snapped open. That was no rustling of leaves. I held my breath, straining to listen. Daniel, help us. A chill ran down my spine. It was a woman's voice, filled with a sorrow that seeped into my bones. I unzipped my tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting feeble light into the surrounding darkness. The forest was cloaked in shadows, the silhouettes of trees stretching like skeletal fingers toward the sky. Marcus, I whispered. No response. I considered calling out louder but hesitated. If someone was out there, did I really want to draw attention? Gathering my courage, I stepped out of the tent. The cold air nipped at my skin. I scanned the area, but everything seemed untouched. Is anyone there? I called softly. Silence. Shaking my head, I retreated to my tent. You're just spooking yourself, I muttered, just as I zipped up the entrance. I heard it again, clearer this time. Daniel, please. It sounded closer, just beyond the tree line. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out once more. Who's there? I demanded, trying to steady my voice. A faint light flickered between the trees, like a lantern swaying gently. Mesmerized, I found myself moving toward it. Daniel! The voice was soothing, almost hypnotic. I felt an inexplicable urge to follow it. I reached the edge of the clearing when a hand grabbed my shoulder. Where are you going? Marcus hissed. I jumped, nearly dropping the flashlight. Jesus, you scared me. You shouldn't answer, he said urgently, his eyes wide with fear. What are you talking about? The whispers, he whispered. I heard them too. We need to stay by the fire. I stared at him, confusion and concern battling within me. Maybe someone needs help. He shook his head vehemently. No, it's not someone. It's something. I read about this. If you follow the whispers, you might not come back. I wanted to argue, to rationalize, but a deep-seated instinct told me he was right. Okay, I conceded. Let's go back. We stoked the fire back to life, its warmth and light providing a small comfort against the encroaching darkness. What's going on? Marcus, I asked after a while. He took a deep breath. There's a legend about this place. Back in the 1800s, enslaved people would escape and use these forests to hide while making their way north. Some didn't make it, they got lost, starved, or worse. It said their spirits still wander, calling out to the living. I frowned. Why didn't you mention this before? He looked away. I didn't want to scare you. I didn't think it was real. We sat in uneasy silence, the crackling fire the only sound between us. Maybe we should leave at first light, I suggested. He nodded. Agreed. Sleep eluded me for the rest of the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt as though unseen eyes were watching us. The whispers had ceased, but the forest felt alive with an unseen presence. At dawn, we quickly packed up our gear. The morning light filtered weakly through the dense canopy, casting the forest in a gray gloom. As we started back toward the main trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Do you feel that? I asked. Marcus nodded grimly. Let's pick up the pace. We hiked briskly, but the path seemed unfamiliar. Trees that I didn't recognize loomed overhead, their twisted branches like grasping hands. Are we going the right way? I asked, anxiety creeping into my voice. He checked the map and compass, a deep frown creasing his forehead. It doesn't make sense. We should have reached the trail by now. A soft rustling behind us made us both spin around. The forest was still. Maybe we passed it, I suggested. Let's backtrack. We retraced our steps, but nothing looked familiar. The forest seemed to shift around us, paths appearing and disappearing like mirages. Daniel, Marcus, the whispers were back, more insistent. Stay together, Marcus warned. We moved cautiously, every snap of a twig setting our nerves on edge. Suddenly, a figure appeared ahead, a woman dressed in tattered clothing from another era. Her eyes were filled with sorrow. Please help us, she pleaded, reaching out a hand. I felt an overwhelming urge to go to her. Don't, Marcus whispered, gripping my arm tightly. She tilted her head, a hint of despair in her expression. We mean you no harm. We're lost. I swallowed hard. We can't help you. She stepped closer. Please, just a moment of your time. Marcus pulled me back. We have to go. The forest around us began to fill with more figures, men, women, even children, all gazing at us with hollow eyes. My heart pounded in my chest. What's happening? We need to run, he said. We bolted, darting between trees, not knowing where we were going but desperate to escape. The whispers grew into a cacophony, voices overlapping in a haunting chorus. "Don't leave us! Stay! Help!" Branches snagged at our clothes. Roots threatened to trip us, but we pressed on. After what felt like an eternity, we burst into a clearing. Ahead of us was the ranger station. Relief flooded through me. "We're back!" We raced toward the building, throwing open the door. The same ranger from before looked up, startled. "Whoa there! What's got you boys all riled up?" We got lost," panted. "There were people in the woods." His expression darkened. "You heard the whispers?" Marcus nodded, still catching his breath. The ranger sighed heavily. "I warned you to stay on the path." "We tried," I insisted. "The forest, it changed." He nodded knowingly. "Homochitto has a way of ensnaring those who wander. The spirits of those who were lost here long ago sometimes reach out, seeking help or company." "What can we do?" Marcus asked. He regarded us thoughtfully. "You're safe now, but others might not be so lucky. Best you spread the word, to respect the forest and its history." We left the ranger station shaken but grateful to be safe. As we drove away from Homochitto, the weight of what we'd experienced settled heavily upon us. "Do you think they'll ever find peace?" I asked quietly. "I hope so," Marcus replied. "Maybe acknowledging them is a start." Back home, I couldn't shake the memories, the sorrow in their eyes, the desperation in their voices. I began researching the history of the area, uncovering stories of the underground railroad routes that ran through the forest, of the countless souls who risked everything for a chance at freedom. I felt a responsibility to honor their memory. Together, Marcus and I organized a small group to place memorials within the forest, plaques acknowledging the history and the lives of those who had passed through, both the known and the lost. On our return trip to Homochitto, the forest felt different, still ancient and vast, but less foreboding. As we installed the first plaque, I felt a gentle breeze rustle the leaves, and for a moment, a sense of peace washed over me. That night, as we camped once more, there were no whispers, only the soothing sounds of the forest at rest. Some nights, I still dream of the woman and the others we saw, but instead of fear, I feel a connection, a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of remembering those who came before us. If you ever find yourself in Homochitto National Forest, take a moment to listen, not to the whispers that might lead you astray, but to the stories the land holds. Respect its history, honor its secrets, and tread lightly, because some voices linger, not to harm, but to remind us of the past we must never forget. Story number 2. The Shadow Man of the Mississippi Delta. I've always been drawn to the quiet allure of the Mississippi Delta, the lazy swirls of the river, the whispering reeds, and the ancient cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. As a freelance photographer, I often sought out isolated places to capture untouched beauty. So when I received an assignment to document the fading traditions of the Delta's small fishing communities, I packed my gear and headed south without hesitation. My journey led me to a tiny town called Willow Creek, a speck on the map surrounded by sprawling wetlands and dense forests. The locals were hospitable but reserved, their eyes reflecting stories they weren't eager to share. I set up camp on the outskirts, near a swampy area that promised stunning sunrise shots. On my first night, I sat by the campfire, the hum of cicadas and the croaking of frogs creating a symphony of wilderness. The air was thick with humidity and the sweet scent of magnolias. As darkness enveloped the forest, a sense of profound solitude settled over me. Around midnight, I heard it, a rustling in the trees, slow and deliberate. I dismissed it as wildlife, a deer or perhaps a stray raccoon scavenging for food. But then the noises grew closer, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps squelching in the muddy ground. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the source. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating twisted branches and hanging moss. but revealed nothing out of the ordinary. The sound ceased, and after a few tense moments, I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. The next morning, eager to shake off the unease, I ventured into town to interview some of the fishermen. Most were tight-lipped, offering only polite nods and one-word answers. But an older man named Earl agreed to talk over a cup of coffee at the local diner. "You ain't from around here, are you?" he asked, stirring sugar into his cup. "No, just visiting for a few days. I'm working on a photo essay." He nodded thoughtfully. "Be careful where you wander. These swamps can be tricky." "I noticed that last night," I said, attempting a light laugh. "I thought I heard something moving around my campsite." Earl's expression darkened. "Did you see anything?" "No, but it sounded like someone or something was out there." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You've heard of the Shadow Man?" I shook my head. "Can't say that I have." Earl glanced around before continuing. "Folks around here don't like to talk about him." A tall figure, dark as midnight, moving through the trees. "Some say he's been here longer than the swamp itself." I raised an eyebrow. "An old legend?" "More than that," he insisted. "Those who've seen him up close don't come back the same, if they come back at all." I smiled politely, not wanting to offend him. "Well, I'll keep an eye out." "Do more than that," he warned. "If you value your life, pack up and leave." That evening, back at my campsite, Earl's words echoed in my mind. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the swamp into a realm of shadows and silhouettes. The fire crackled softly as I reviewed the day's photos on my camera. Around 11 p.m., a dense fog rolled in, blanketing the area in a milky haze. The sounds of the swamp grew distant, muffled by the thick air. Then, faintly at first, I heard the footsteps again, slow, deliberate, and closer than the night before. I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. Clutching my flashlight, I stood up, straining to peer into the mist. "Hello," I called out, my voice unnaturally loud in the stillness. No response. A dark shape materialized between the cypress trees, a towering figure that seemed to absorb the light. It stood motionless, its form indistinct but undeniably human-like. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. The figure moved, gliding rather than walking, disappearing behind a curtain of moss. My heart pounded in my chest, determined not to let fear get the better of me. I grabbed my camera and snapped a few shots in the direction where the figure had stood. Reviewing the images, I saw nothing but trees and fog, no sign of the Shadow Man. Sleep eluded me that night. Every rustle, every whisper of wind set my nerves on edge. By dawn, I was exhausted but resolute. I decided to head back into town, hoping to find someone who could offer a rational explanation. At the diner, I found Earl seated at the counter. He looked up as I entered, his eyes reflecting a mixture of concern and resignation. "You saw him, didn't you?" he asked as I slid onto the stool beside him. I think so," I admitted. "It was probably just shadows in the fog." Earl shook his head. "Denial won't help you. The Shadow Man's marked you now." "Marked me?" I scoffed. "Listen, I appreciate the local folklore, but there's got to be a logical." He cut me off. "Years ago, a man named Joseph came through here, much like you, didn't heed the warnings. After he saw the Shadow Man, he became obsessed, tried to find him. One day, he just vanished. All we found were his footprints leading into the swamp, circling his own campsite over and over, like he was chasing his own shadow." A chill settled over me. "What are you suggesting I do?" "Leave, today. Don't look back." I wanted to argue, but the earnestness in his gaze gave me pause. Back at my campsite, I began packing up. As I disassembled my tent, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Massive footprints encircling the area. They were elongated, too large to be human, pressed deep into the muddy ground. My hands trembled as I traced one with my boot. hadn't been there when I left that morning. A rustling sound made me snap upright. Across the clearing, the shadow man stood, clearer than before. He was impossibly tall, his limbs elongated, body cloaked in darkness that seemed to ripple like smoke. "Who are you?" I shouted, fear sharpening my voice. He raised an arm, pointing a long, shadowy finger at me. Panic surged. I grabbed my backpack and camera, abandoning the rest of my gear, and sprinted toward my car parked half a mile away. The swamp seemed to conspire against me. Roots snared my feet, branches clawed at my arms, and the mud sucked at my boots. Behind me, I heard the relentless squelching of footsteps. I dared a glance over my shoulder. The shadow man was pursuing me, gliding effortlessly through the terrain. My lungs burned, but adrenaline pushed me forward, bursting onto the gravel road where my car was parked. I fumbled with the keys, hands slick with sweat. I threw myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door just as a dark shape loomed at the edge of the trees. The engine roared to life, and I sped away, gravel spraying under my tires. In the rearview mirror, the shadow man stood in the middle of the road, watching as I fled, back in the safety of my apartment in New Orleans. I tried to rationalize the experience. Exhaustion, overactive imagination, maybe even hallucinations caused by swamp gases. But the nightmares persisted, visions of endless swamps and a faceless figure stalking me through the mist. One morning, as I scrolled through the photos on my camera, I found images I didn't remember taking. They were all of the swamp at night, but in each one, the shadow man appeared, sometimes distant, sometimes alarmingly close. In one, he stood at the foot of my tent, staring directly at the lens. I felt a suffocating dread. How was this possible? Desperate for answers, I researched local legends and found scant references to the shadow man, a spirit tied to the land, a harbinger of doom for those who crossed his path. I reached out to a professor of folklore at LSU, Dr. Margaret Holloway. After hearing my story, she agreed to meet. Dr. Holloway was a petite woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. As I recounted my experiences, she listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. Many cultures have legends of shadow beings, she explained. They often symbolize death or serve as guardians of certain places. Why me? I asked. I didn't do anything to provoke him. Perhaps merely by entering his domain, you drew his attention. Or maybe he seeks something. Like what? She studied me for a moment. Hard to say, but these entities feed on fear. The more you acknowledge them, the stronger they become. How do I stop this? My voice wavered. You might try a cleansing ritual, or perhaps return to offer a token of respect. But there's no guarantee. The thought of returning to Willow Creek filled me with dread. But I knew I had to confront this, armed with sage, candles, and a protective talisman Dr. Holloway had given me. I drove back to the Delta. The town seemed even more desolate, the air thick with an oppressive weight. Earl was waiting at the diner, as if expecting me. I figured you'd be back, he said. I need to make this right, I told him. He nodded slowly. I thought as much. Come with me. Earl led me to a small clearing near the swamp's edge. This is where it all began, he said, gesturing to an old, weathered tree. What do you mean? Generations ago, a man was unjustly hanged here, accused of crimes he didn't commit. His spirit never left. I felt a surge of anger. Why didn't anyone tell me? Would you have believed me? He had a point. We performed the cleansing ritual together. As the smoke from the sage swirled upward, I felt a shift in the air, a release. For a moment, everything was still. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw him, the shadow man, standing at the edge of the clearing. But this time, he seemed less solid, his form wavering. I'm sorry, I whispered, unsure if he could hear me. I'm sorry for what happened to you. He raised a hand, not in menace but almost in acknowledgement. Then, slowly, he dissolved into the shadows. Earl placed a hand on my shoulder. It's done. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "Thank you. Respect the land and those who came before," he said. "That's all anyone asks." Back home, the nightmares ceased. The photos on my camera returned to normal, and I began to find peace again. The experience left an indelible mark on me. I published my photo essay, including a section about the legend of the Shadow Man, treating it with the respect it deserved. I received a letter shortly after from Willow Creek's small historical society, thanking me for shedding light on a part of their past long buried. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the Shadow Man and what he represented, a lingering echo of injustice, a guardian of memories that refuse to be forgotten. If you ever find yourself in the depths of the Mississippi Delta, tread lightly. The land remembers, and sometimes the shadows are more than just the absence of light. Because in places where history runs deep and wounds have yet to heal, the past isn't dead, it watches, it waits, and if you're not careful, it might just reach out to claim you. Story number 3. The haunting lights of Pascagoula Swamp. I've always been fascinated by the unknown. As a freelance journalist specializing in the paranormal, I've chased legends from the foggy moors of Scotland to the dense jungles of the Amazon. But nothing prepared me for what I encountered in the Pascagoula Swamp of Mississippi. It started with an email from a reader named Lucas. He claimed that strange lights were appearing in the swamp at night, unsettling the locals and terrifying campers. He described them as flickering blue and yellow orbs that moved erratically through the murky waters and dense foliage. Intrigued, I arranged to meet Lucas in Pascagoula. I arrived on a humid August afternoon, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. The town itself was unremarkable, small, quiet, the kind of place where everyone knows each other's business. But the swamp was another world entirely. Lucas was waiting for me at a dilapidated diner on the outskirts of town. He was a wiry man in his late 30s, with sun-weathered skin and eyes that darted nervously around the room. "You're brave to come here," he said as we shook hands. "Brave or foolish?" I replied with a smile. "Either way, I'm here, over cups of bitter coffee." He told me more about the lights. "They started appearing a few months ago," he said. "At first, folks thought it was swamp gas or maybe some teenagers playing pranks. But then people started feeling things. Things?" He leaned in closer. "A chill, like someone walking over your grave. Fear, so intense it freezes you in your tracks. Some say they hear whispers in a language they can't understand. Have you seen them yourself?" He nodded slowly. "Once. That's all it took." "Will you take me there?" His eyes widened. "No way. I swore I'd never go back." I tried to persuade him, but he was adamant. "If you're smart, you'll forget about this and go home," he warned. But I wasn't about to let the story slip away. That evening, armed with my camera, recorder, and a healthy dose of skepticism, I headed into the swamp alone. The Pascagoula Swamp is both beautiful and foreboding. Ancient cypress trees rose from the murky waters, their gnarled roots twisting like arthritic fingers. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of blood red and gold, casting long shadows that danced on the water's surface. I found a solid patch of ground to set up camp, a small clearing surrounded by dense foliage. As darkness fell, the symphony of nocturnal creatures began. The croaking of frogs, the distant hoot of an owl, the incessant drone of cicadas. Hours passed, and aside from a few mosquito bites, nothing out of the ordinary occurred. I was beginning to think Lucas had been overly dramatic. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night, just as I was zipping up my tent. I noticed a faint glow reflecting off the water. First, I thought it was the moon, but when I looked up, the moon was hidden behind thick clouds. I stepped out of the tent and saw them, two floating orbs of light hovering above the swamp. One blue, the other yellow. They flickered like lanterns in the wind, swaying gently from side to side. Grabbing my camera, I snapped several photos. The lights seemed to respond. Drifting closer to my campsite, a sudden chill enveloped me. raising goosebumps on my arms despite the humid air. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small against the vastness of the swamp. No response. The lights continued their slow approach. I felt an inexplicable mix of awe and dread. Part of me wanted to reach out and touch them. Another part wanted to pack up and run. The air grew colder still. My breath fogged in front of me. The sounds of the swamp had ceased entirely. No frogs, no insects, just an oppressive silence. Then I heard it. A faint whisper carried on the breeze. It was melodic yet haunting, like a lament sung in a forgotten language. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. The lights paused, hovering just a few yards away. For a moment, they merged into a single, brilliant orb before separating again. I took a cautious step forward. "I don't mean any harm. I'm just here to understand." Suddenly, a shadow moved in the periphery of my vision. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness. Nothing. When I turned back, the lights had vanished. A deep sense of unease settled over me. I decided it was time to leave. As I hastily packed my gear, the whispers resumed, louder this time, more urgent. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the tent poles. The whispers grew into a cacophony of voices, overlapping and echoing. The temperature plummeted further. "Stop it!" I shouted, covering my ears. And then, just as abruptly as it had begun, the noise ceased, the warmth returned, and the sounds of the swamp life resumed. I stood there, heart pounding, sweat trickling down my forehead. Whatever had happened, it was over for now. Back in town, I reviewed the photos on my camera. To my frustration, they showed nothing but darkness. No lights, no shadows, nothing to validate my experience. I needed answers. The local library seemed like a good place to start. The librarian, Ms. Thompson, was a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a tight bun. When I mentioned the lights, she pursed her lips. "You're not the first to ask about those," she said. "Do you know what they are?" She hesitated before replying. "Some say they're the spirits of the Pascagoula tribe." I was familiar with the name. Weren't they an indigenous people who lived around here? She nodded. Legend has it that they walked into the river en masse, singing as they drowned, to avoid capture by a rival tribe. That's tragic. Indeed, it said their voices and spirits linger, especially in times of unrest. Unrest. She gave me a pointed look. "This town has its secrets, Mr. Harper." "Like what?" She glanced around nervously. "That's all I can say." Unsatisfied, I decided to dig deeper. Over the next few days, I interviewed locals, but most were tight-lipped or dismissed the stories as old wives' tales. Then I met Clara, a young woman who worked at the local bait shop. She agreed to talk over coffee. "I've seen the lights," she admitted, stirring her cup absent-mindedly. "Many times. Why do you think they appear?" She sighed. "My grandmother used to say they're warnings, signs that something bad is coming." "Like what?" She looked out the window, her eyes distant. "Disaster, death. They appeared before the big hurricane 10 years ago, and before the factory fire that killed 6 people. A chill ran through me. "Do you feel anything when you see them?" "Cold, fear, but also sadness, like they're mourning." "Do you think they're trying to communicate?" "Maybe, or maybe they're trapped, reliving their final moments over and over." Her words lingered with me. That night, I resolved to return to the swamp one last time. This time, I came prepared with thermal imaging equipment and a high-sensitivity audio recorder. If the lights appeared again, I'd have proof. I set up in the same spot, the swamp eerily quiet around me. Midnight came and went with no activity. At around 2 a.m., just as fatigue was setting in, the temperature gauge on my equipment dropped sharply. My breath became visible in the cold air. Then, there they were, the lights, brighter than before. They moved in a slow circle around my campsite. I activated the recorder. "This is Daniel Harper. The lights have appeared again. Temperature has dropped to 40 degrees. The whispers began. More distinct this time. The recorder picked up faint voices. The language unfamiliar but hauntingly beautiful. I watched as the lights moved closer, merging and separating in a hypnotic dance. "Can you understand me?" I called out. For a moment, the whispers stopped. One of the lights hovered directly in front of me, mere feet away. "Please, tell me what you want," pleaded. A sudden rush of images flooded my mind. Faces contorted in sorrow, hands reaching out, water closing overhead. I felt their despair, their resignation. Then, just as quickly, the connection severed. The lights drifted away, fading into the darkness. The temperature began to rise, and the sounds of the swamp returned. I sank to the ground, overwhelmed. They had shown me their final moments, the collective suicide of a people choosing death over subjugation. Back in my motel room, I replayed the audio. The whispers were clear, but still unintelligible. I sent the file to a colleague who specialized in indigenous languages. A day later, he called me, his voice tinged with excitement and unease. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. "Why?" "Because it's a dialect of a long-extinct language, possibly from the Pascagoula tribe. Can you translate it?" "Parts of it. They're saying we sing for the lost. We mourn. Remember us." A shiver ran down my spine. "Thank you." I knew what I had to do. I reached out to a local tribal council, sharing my experiences and the audio recording. They agreed to hold a ceremony to honor the Pascagoula spirits. The night of the ceremony, elders gathered by the swamp, singing songs passed down through generations. They offered prayers and floated lanterns on the water as a symbol of guidance. As the lanterns drifted away, a hush fell over the crowd. The familiar lights appeared once more, but this time, they seemed softer, more at peace. They lingered for a few moments before ascending skyward and disappearing altogether. An overwhelming sense of calm settled over the area. An elder placed a hand on my shoulder. "They have been acknowledged," he said softly. "Perhaps now they can rest." I left Pascagoula the next day, my mind and heart heavy with the weight of what I'd experienced. I wrote the article, not as a sensational ghost story, but as a tribute to a lost people yearning to be remembered. The piece garnered significant attention, sparking interest in the history of the Pascagoula tribe and the importance of preserving indigenous cultures and stories. Months later, I received a letter from Clara. "Since the ceremony, the lights haven't appeared. The swamp feels different now, lighter, as if a burden has been lifted. Thank you for helping us bring them peace." I folded the letter thoughtfully. In chasing a story, I had stumbled upon a lingering tragedy and, in some small way, helped to heal old wounds. Even now, I sometimes dream of the swamp, the towering cypress trees, the murky waters, and the hauntingly beautiful lights. But in my dreams, the whispers are gone, replaced by a serene silence. If you ever find yourself in Pascagoula, take a moment to honor the past. Listen to the wind, respect the land, and remember that some stories are etched not in books, but in the very fabric of a place. Because sometimes, the spirits of the past are closer than we think, waiting for someone to acknowledge them, to set them free. Story number 4. The Faceless Woman of Yazoo Swamp. I've always been fascinated by the forgotten corners of the world, the places where history clings like moss to the gnarled trees, where legends seep into the soil and the air hangs heavy with whispers of the past. That's what drew me to Yazoo Swamp in Mississippi, a place as enigmatic as it is foreboding. It started innocently enough. My friend Lucas and I were amateur paranormal investigators, more out of hobby than any real belief in the supernatural. We'd heard stories about the Yazoo Swamp, tales of strange lights and eerie sounds, but one legend stood out among the rest: the Faceless Woman. People say she was a witch. Lucas told me as we drove down the winding back roads toward the swamp, accused of dark magic, executed without a fair trial. I glanced over at him. Executed how? He shrugged. Depends on who you ask. Some say she was hanged. Others say she was burned. All agree she haunts the swamp now, a faceless apparition that drives men mad. I smirked. Sounds like a campfire tale to me. Maybe, Lucas replied, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. But everyone who's seen her swears they felt a terror unlike anything else. I didn't believe in ghosts or curses, but the allure of uncovering the truth behind the legend was too enticing to pass up. So there we were, heading into the heart of Mississippi's most notorious swamp. We arrived just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the landscape in hues of orange and purple. The swamp was vast, a labyrinth of murky water and twisted cypress trees draped with Spanish moss. The air was thick with humidity, the scent of damp earth and decaying vegetation permeating everything. We set up camp on a patch of dry land elevated slightly above the swamp waters. As night fell, the chorus of insects and frogs grew louder, a symphony of nature that was both soothing and unsettling. Ready to explore? Lucas asked, adjusting the strap of his backpack loaded with recording equipment and flashlights. I nodded, trying to ignore the knot of unease forming in my stomach. Let's see if we can find any signs of our faceless friend. We ventured deeper into the swamp, the beam of our flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. The trees seemed to close in around us, their twisted branches like skeletal hands reaching out. After about an hour of walking, we came upon a clearing where the ground was firmer. In the center stood the remnants of an old wooden structure, barely more than a few rotted beams protruding from the ground. Think this was her house? I asked. Lucas scanned the area with his flashlight. Could be. Let's set up the EVP recorder here. As he fiddled with the equipment, I wandered a bit, my eyes drawn to strange symbols carved into one of the remaining wooden posts. They looked ancient, indecipherable. Hey, check this out. I called to Lucas. He walked over, his brow furrowed. What do you think it means? No idea. Maybe some kind of warning. A sudden chill ran down my spine, despite the humid air. I shivered. Cold? Lucas asked. Just a weird feeling. I replied. We spent the next hour conducting our investigation, asking questions into the darkness, hoping for any sign of the paranormal. But aside from the usual sounds of the swamp, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Maybe the legend is just that. A legend, I said, trying to mask my disappointment. Could be, Lucas admitted, but sometimes things happen when you least expect them. We decided to head back to camp. The path seemed different on the return trip. The trees more twisted, the shadows deeper. The sounds of the swamp grew muted, as if the creatures were holding their breath. Did we take a wrong turn? I asked, shining my flashlight around. I don't remember this part. Lucas checked his GPS device, frowning. That's odd. It's not picking up any signal. A sense of unease settled over me. Great. We're lost in a haunted swamp. He laughed nervously. Relax. We can't be too far off. We pressed on, but the further we walked, the more disoriented we became. The mist began to roll in, thick and heavy, obscuring our vision. Maybe we should stay put until the fog clears, Lucas suggested, before I could respond. A sound reached my ears, a soft, distant humming. It was melodic, almost hypnotic. Do you hear that? I whispered. Lucas nodded slowly. Sounds like singing. We stood still, straining to locate the source. The humming grew louder, morphing into a mournful tune that sent chills coursing through my body. This is not normal, I said, my voice barely audible. Suddenly, the singing stopped. An oppressive silence enveloped us. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadow flitting between the trees. There's someone out there, I whispered. Hello, Lucas called out. We're lost. Can you help us? No response. The shadow moved again, closer this time. Maybe we should go back the way we came, I suggested, my heart pounding. Agreed. We turned to leave, but the path behind us was now shrouded in darkness, the mist thicker than ever. Stay close, Lucas said. his voice tense. As we edged forward, the humming resumed, louder and more distorted. It seemed to come from all directions. "Who's there?" I shouted, desperation creeping into my voice. And then we saw her. Emerging from the mist was the figure of a woman draped in a tattered black cloak. She stood motionless, her face hidden beneath a hood. "Ma'am," Lucas ventured cautiously, "we don't mean any harm. We're just lost." She lifted her head slowly. The hood fell back, revealing the impossible, a blank expanse where a face should be. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin. I felt a scream clawing at my throat, but no sound came out. Terror rooted me to the spot. Lucas grabbed my arm. "Run!" We bolted blindly into the darkness, branches whipping against our faces. The humming escalated into a cacophony of wails, echoing through the swamp. Behind us, I could hear the squelching of footsteps, impossibly fast, closing the distance. "Don't look back," Lucas shouted, but I couldn't help myself. I glanced over my shoulder and saw her gliding toward us, her cloak billowing as if caught in a storm. Though the air was still, my foot caught on a root, and I tumbled to the ground. Pain shot up my leg. "Get up!" Lucas yelled, pulling me to my feet. We burst into a small clearing, and for a moment, the mist parted. Ahead, I saw the faint glow of our campfire. "There!" I gasped. We stumbled toward the light, the wails fading behind us. As we reached the campsite, the normal sounds of the swamp resumed, as if nothing had happened. Collapsing by the fire, we struggled to catch our breath. What the hell was that? I panted. Lucas shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here." We hastily gathered our belongings, extinguishing the fire. The adrenaline masked the throbbing pain in my ankle as we loaded our gear into the truck. I glanced back toward the swamp. The mist swirled at the edge of the trees, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw her standing there, watching us with that featureless face. "Let's go," Lucas urged. We drove in silence, the weight of the experience pressing down on us. Only when we were miles away did we dare to speak. "Do you think it was real?" I asked, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Lucas stared out the window. "I don't know, but it felt real. Maybe we imagined it." He turned to look at me, his eyes haunted. "Both of us? At the same time?" I didn't have an answer. Back home, sleep evaded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, the faceless woman, her emptiness a void that threatened to consume me. I delved into research, seeking any information about the legend. Old newspaper articles, local histories, anything that might shed light on who she was. I discovered a story from the late 1800s about a woman named Abigail Hartley. She was an herbalist who lived on the edge of the Yazoo Swamp, known for her remedies and midwifery. When a series of unexplained illnesses struck the town, suspicion turned toward her. Accusations of witchcraft spread like wildfire. One night, a mob dragged her from her home. Without trial or mercy, they executed her in the swamp. Accounts varied on the method. Some said she was hanged. Others claimed she was drowned. Her last words, according to one witness, were a curse upon the town. "May your faces be stripped as mine, your identities erased, until justice is served." I shuddered at the thought. Was the faceless woman seeking vengeance? Was she trapped between worlds, a restless spirit unable to find peace? I reached out to Lucas with what I'd found. "We have to go back," I told him over the phone. "Are you insane?" he replied. "We barely escaped last time. I think I know how to help her." He was silent for a moment. "What makes you think she wants help?" "Maybe she needs someone to acknowledge the injustice done to her. Maybe that's why she's haunting the swamp." He sighed. "Even if that's true, why is that our responsibility?" "Because we started this. We went looking for her." Reluctantly, he agreed to return, armed with what we hoped would appease her. A proper memorial and a willingness to listen, we headed back to Yazoo Swamp. As we set up the simple wooden cross near the remains of her home, the air felt heavy, charged with an energy that made my skin prickle. "We're sorry for what happened to you, Abigail," I said aloud. "You didn't deserve it." Lucas placed a bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the cross. "We hope you can find peace." For a while, nothing happened. The swamp was eerily quiet, the usual cacophony of sounds absent. Then, a soft breeze rustled the leaves, and I heard it, the humming, gentle this time, almost soothing. She appeared at the edge of the clearing, her form less defined, more ethereal. "Thank you," a voice whispered in my mind, though her faceless visage remained unchanged. A sense of calm washed over me. "Do you think it's over?" Lucas asked softly. "I hope so." She lingered a moment longer before fading into the mist, the shadows swallowing her whole. We left the swamp as dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the trees. The atmosphere felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifted. Back in town, we shared our experience with a local historian. She listened with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. "Many have tried to put her spirit to rest," she said. "Perhaps your acknowledgement made a difference. Do you think she'll finally find peace?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "Only time will tell." Months passed, and life returned to normal. The nightmares ceased, and the memory of that night became a distant echo. One day, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was an old photograph of a woman standing in front of a cabin in the swamp. She wore a simple dress, her face partially obscured by shadows, but there was no mistaking the resemblance to the faceless woman. On the back, a message read, "She is remembered." I showed it to Lucas, and we both felt a sense of closure. "Maybe now she can rest," he said. "I'd like to think so. Some say the Yazoo Swamp is still haunted, but not by malevolent spirits. Campers report feeling a gentle presence, a watchful guardian ensuring they come to no harm." I returned once more. Years later, standing by the makeshift memorial we'd erected, the swamp was alive with sounds, but none of them sinister. "Rest in peace, Abigail," I whispered as I turned to leave. I thought I heard a soft humming carried on the breeze, a melody not of sorrow, but of contentment. Story number 5. The Curse of Sardis Lake. I've always been a fan of the great outdoors. Growing up in Mississippi, I'd spent countless weekends fishing, hiking, and camping in the many natural spots our state has to offer. But nothing compared to Sardis Lake, a sprawling reservoir surrounded by lush forests and serene landscapes. When my buddy Mark suggested a weekend camping trip there, I jumped at the chance. "Are you sure about Sardis?" my girlfriend Emily asked as I packed my gear. "I've heard some unsettling stories." I laughed it off. "Come on. Those are just old legends to scare kids. Besides, we could use a break from work." She sighed, giving me a worried look. "Just be careful, okay? Always," I assured her with a kiss on the forehead. Mark and I set out early Saturday morning, the sun casting golden hues across the horizon. The drive was filled with the usual banter and country music blasting from the radio. We arrived at Sardis Lake by noon, the water shimmering under the bright sky. "This place is perfect," Mark exclaimed, stretching his arms wide. "No distractions, just us and nature." We found a secluded spot near the shoreline to set up camp. The area was surprisingly empty for a weekend, but we didn't mind. After pitching our tents, we spent the afternoon fishing. The catch was good, and by evening, we were grilling fresh fish over a crackling fire. As night fell, the moon cast a silver glow over the lake. The gentle lapping of water against the shore was calming, almost hypnotic. "Did you ever hear the legend of the Lady of Sardis Lake?" Mark asked, his face illuminated by the firelight. I rolled my eyes. "You mean the ghost stories? Spare me." He grinned. "Come on, it's part of the camping experience. They say a woman drowned here decades ago. Some say she walks the shores at night, looking for unsuspecting campers. Very spooky," I mocked, tossing another log onto the fire. He shrugged. "Believe what you want. Just don't wander off alone." We shared a laugh and settled into our tents as the fire died down. The cool night air was refreshing, and I drifted off quickly. I woke to the sound of footsteps squelching along the wet shoreline. Groggy, I glanced at my watch. 2:47 a.m. Must be Mark. I thought, maybe he couldn't sleep. Mark, I called out softly. No response. Curious, I unzipped my tent and peered outside. A mist had settled over the lake, giving everything a ghostly aura. Then I saw her, a figure in a white dress, her long hair damp and clinging to her back, walking slowly along the water's edge. My heart skipped a beat. Was I dreaming? Hello, I called out tentatively. She didn't react, continuing her slow, deliberate pace. I stepped out of the tent, the cool sand beneath my feet grounding me in reality. Ma'am, are you okay? Still no response. I glanced back at Mark's tent. It was zipped shut. Should I wake him? Deciding against it, I grabbed a flashlight and began walking toward the figure. As I got closer, an icy chill enveloped me. The air seemed heavier, each step more labored than the last. Excuse me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She stopped. A sense of unease washed over me. The woman turned slowly to face me. Her eyes were vacant, hollow, like deep wells of sorrow. Water dripped from her pale skin, but there were no ripples where she stood. A lump formed in my throat. Do you need help? Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Instead, she raised a hand and pointed directly at me. A sudden rush of fear jolted me backward. I stumbled, dropping the flashlight. When I looked up, she was gone. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the lake and my own ragged breathing. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed the flashlight, and hurried back to camp, bursting into Mark's tent. I shook him awake. What's going on? He mumbled, rubbing his eyes. I saw someone, I stammered. A woman. She was out by the lake. He sat up, concern flashing across his face. Was she hurt? I don't know. She just vanished. He frowned. Maybe it was a dream. It wasn't a dream, Mark. I was wide awake. He sighed, throwing off his sleeping bag. All right, let's check it out. We searched the shoreline but found nothing. No footprints. No signs of anyone having been there. See? Nothing, he said, though his tone lacked conviction. I'm not crazy, Mark. I didn't say you were. Maybe it was a trick of the light or shadows. Let's get back to sleep. Reluctantly, I agreed, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay awake, listening to every sound, every rustle of the wind. The next morning, I was exhausted. Mark suggested we go for a hike to clear our heads. We followed a trail that looped around the lake, the fresh air helping to shake off the night's events. Look, about last night, Mark began. I'm sorry if I seemed dismissive. I believe that you believe you saw something. I sighed. Maybe you're right. Maybe it was just my imagination. As we continued, we came across an old man fishing along the shore. His weathered face and faded overalls gave him the appearance of someone who'd spent his life by the water. Morning, he greeted us with a nod. Morning, we replied in unison. Beautiful day, isn't it? He mused, casting his line. Sure is, Mark agreed. Say, you wouldn't happen to know any local legends about this place, would you? The old man chuckled softly. Ah, looking for ghost stories. Are ya? Something like that, I said. He studied me for a moment. You're not from around here, are you? No, sir. Just camping for the weekend. He sighed, turning his gaze to the lake. They say the spirit of a woman haunts these waters. Lost her life long ago. Some folks have seen her wandering the shores at night. I felt a chill. Do you believe in it? He shrugged. I've seen things I can't explain. Whether you believe or not doesn't change what's true. How did she die? I asked. Story goes she was waiting for her lover, a fisherman who never returned. Heartbroken, she walked into the lake and let the waters take her. A heavy silence settled between us. Best be careful out there. he warned. The lake doesn't give up its dead easily. We thanked him and continued on our way. See? Just a legend, Mark said, trying to sound upbeat. Yeah, just a legend, I echoed, but doubt gnawed at me. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As darkness fell, I found myself constantly glancing toward the lake. Let's keep the fire going tonight, I suggested. Mark gave me a curious look but obliged. Sure thing. Around midnight, as we sat roasting marshmallows, a sudden splash drew our attention. What was that? Mark asked. Probably a fish, I said, though my voice wavered. Then came the footsteps, wet, sloshing sounds approaching from the shoreline. We both stood up, peering into the darkness. Hello, Mark called out. Is someone there? No answer. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the water. The beam revealed the woman from the night before, standing ankle-deep in the lake, staring directly at us. Mark gasped. You weren't kidding. She began to move toward us, her motions fluid yet unnatural. Get inside the tent, I whispered, pulling on his arm. We backed away slowly, but she continued to advance. Please, leave us alone, pleaded. She paused, her head tilting as if contemplating. Why are you here? Mark demanded, though fear quaked in his voice. Suddenly, the fire extinguished, plunging us into darkness. Panic surged through me. Run! I shouted. We bolted into the woods, branches scratching at our arms and faces. Behind us, the sound of footsteps followed, impossibly fast and closing in. We burst into a clearing, the moonlight offering scant illumination. Looking back, we saw nothing. Did we lose her? Mark panted. I don't know, I whispered. Then, from the shadows, her figure emerged, gliding toward us. This can't be happening, Mark muttered, desperate. I remembered the old man's words. She lost someone she loved, I said aloud. Maybe she thinks we can help. How? I don't know. She was mere feet away now, in a final act of desperation. I stepped forward. We're sorry for what happened to you, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But we don't belong here. She stopped, her expression unreadable. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then, slowly, she raised her hand and pointed back toward the campsite. What does that mean? Mark asked. I think she wants us to leave. We didn't need further prompting, keeping a wary eye on her. We made our way back. She didn't follow. We packed up in record time, the first hints of dawn staining the sky. As we drove away, I glanced back to see her standing on the shore, fading into the morning mist. Do you think she'll let us go? Mark asked quietly. I hope so, I replied. Back home, I tried to resume normal life, but nights were plagued with dreams of dark waters and hollow eyes. Emily noticed the change. You're not yourself, she said one evening. What happened out there? I told her everything. She listened without interruption, her face a mix of concern and disbelief. You need to let this go, she advised gently. Maybe talk to someone. I nodded, but I knew it wasn't that simple. Weeks later, I received a package with no return address. Inside was an old photograph of a woman resembling the apparition we'd seen, standing beside a young man in fishing gear. On the back, a note read, "She still waits." Chills ran down my spine. Who sent this? How did they know? I decided to dig deeper, visiting local archives and libraries. I discovered that in the 1940s, a woman named Evelyn lost her fiancé to a boating accident on Sardis Lake. Distraught, she drowned herself in those same waters. Her body was never recovered. I realized then that her restless spirit was bound to the lake, eternally searching for her lost love. One night, compelled by a force I couldn't explain, I returned to Sardis Lake alone. Standing on the shore, I called out into the darkness. Evelyn, if you're there, I hope you find peace. The water remained still, the night silent. As I turned to leave, a soft whisper carried on the breeze. Thank you, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Since that night, the nightmares ceased. I like to believe that acknowledging her pain helped her move on, or perhaps it was for my own closure. Either way, I learned that some places carry the echoes of the past, and sometimes the past reaches out to the present. If you ever find yourself at Sardis Lake after dark, be respectful, and if you see a lady in white walking along the shore, keep your distance, because some souls are lost, and others are searching, and sometimes they might mistake you for the one they lost. Thank you for joining us on this spine-chilling journey through Mississippi's haunted forests and swamps. From the ghostly lights of Pascagoula to the terrifying Shadow Man in Delta Forest. These stories remind us that even the stillness of nature can hide unimaginable horrors. If you enjoyed these tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another dive into the unknown. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, in the dark depths of Mississippi, the shadows are always watching.